You are listening to Medicine and the Machine with Medscape Editor-in-Chief Eric Topol and Master Storyteller and Clinician Abraham Verghese as they talk with experts around the globe about the hottest topics in healthcare. This podcast is intended for U.S. healthcare professionals only.
Hello, this is Eric Topol for Medicine and the Machine with my co-host Abraham Verghese, and we are really delighted to have Dr. Michael Minnow join us today. He has a really rich background. He's been training for the pandemic related matters throughout his life, young life, I should say. He was at Dartmouth in engineering and global health for undergrad. He went to Emory for a combined MD, PhD, worked at the CDC, at the Emory Vaccine Center, one of our nation's leading vaccine centers. Did his postdoc at Princeton and Harvard, also worked in evolutionary biology. So he's an epidemiologist, an immunologist, a physician. He was at Harvard on the faculty, both at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and also the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and recently went to EMED. And so, Michael, welcome. Great to have you.
Thanks so much. Very happy to be here.
Well, you know, we've known each other through the pandemic. And when I think about testing, there's one go-to person in the world, certainly in this country, and it's you. So you have this, really fascinating background. How did you zoom in on the whole PCR and rapid testing front in the pandemic?
Yeah, it started actually back in January of 2020. We were wearing my epidemiology hat. We were already starting to track the virus and its spread throughout each of the provinces in China. And it became, obvious, I would say, to a lot of people that this was going to become a pandemic. As soon as you see a virus like that spread from Wuhan to every single province in China in no time at all, it's clear that this is going to spread globally. And so at that point in time, I started trying to get I was a medical director at the Brigham in charge of molecular virology diagnostics, and I tried to get the hospital leadership to recognize the need for testing. The first time I brought it up to the hospital leadership, I was more or less laughed out of the room. That was mid-January of 2020, saying, well, why would we need to, we're too busy with everything else we got going on here. Why would we get COVID testing up and running? That's not a problem here. I kept pushing on that. And ultimately I went to the Broad Institute where Eric Lander was leading at the time. And has been obviously leading and started said, you guys are some of the most efficient biologists in terms of really scaling up biology in the world. Can we get COVID testing? Can we start processing COVID tests in the genetics facility that you have here? It's high throughput facility, they had all the robots. And so we started doing that. And that got me really on, I realized very early that I was the only epidemiologist that I knew who was talking about testing. And everyone else was saying, well, when are the vaccines going to be here? This and that. And it turned out that there's almost no overlap, at least pre-pandemic, between epidemiologists and testing. And I think it's because, the data is just always there. If you're an epidemiologist, you have the case count somehow, and you never really ask the question, how exactly am I getting this data in terms of where are the instruments? How are they being used? And this obviously has now become common knowledge in the US, this whole idea of testing. But back in 2019, nobody thought about testing. It just wasn't a common word. That it was always this thing that the doctor does. And it became I became acutely aware of the need. As soon as Biogen conference happened in Boston, it made sense that we had gotten the Broad Institute set up with testing. And then it was really that experience where we got the Broad's high throughput testing program started. And they're, as I said, one of the world's best, most efficient molecular biology groups. And it became clear that we weren't going to keep up. And that's when I really started looking at other avenues to go down and said, maybe we're thinking about this all wrong. At the time, the FDA was really scrutinizing the sensitivity, well, they still are, the sensitivity of every assay. And I just said, we don't need that kind of sensitivity if people have ready access to rapid tests. And so I feel like I, on the one hand, really started certain aspects of the PCR testing program, but it was through that experience that I realized that we needed a different option. And that led to a cascade of research around a different type of testing for a pandemic.
You think that your unique background, I must say, I think it's quite unique in engineering and mathematics and global health. Do you think that's what brought you a different perspective than many other epidemiologists? And talk about your background a little more, if you would. I'm fascinated by these different things that you brought into your pre-medical and medical career.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think something that I've tried very hard to do, whether it be in medicine or in public health, is always incorporate engineering principles. And frankly, just by bringing all these different views in, whether it be evolutionary biology and mathematics, engineering and medicine, bringing all of that in, into an orbit together. And the pandemic kind of forced that issue to bring all of those pieces together. I think certainly gave a very different perspective for me. I think the other piece that really gave me a different perspective, and I'm happy to talk about the engineering sort of side of public health that I think has been sorely lacking, but is I'm a clinical pathologist. And so wearing my medical hat, I was really privileged early in the pandemic to get a peek behind the curtain, or develop what was behind the curtain, if you will, of where these lab tests are being processed. What are the challenges that we should expect? And these are questions that, just because it's a whole different orbit than where public health people usually live, in terms of the majority of infectious disease epidemiologists aren't dealing with the laboratories themselves. And so I think it was that perspective quite a lot, my medical hat, that gave me this whole understanding that, hey, the conversations we were having early in the pandemic about the epidemiology of this virus, there were very few people who were really considering in their math models the growth rate, for example, not of the virus, but the growth rate of the testing apparatus in a country. And I think that some of the earliest models that we built on the growth of this virus across the world, in terms of case counts, we weren't measuring the growth of the virus itself. We were measuring the capacity for a nation to process PCR tests. And it was seeing these challenges in terms of getting PCR testing set up that, on the one hand, really made me recognize, hey, we're probably way undercounting much more than most epidemiologists are considering. And on the other hand, made me realize, hey, there is no way that we need to rethink testing in this world for a pandemic if our goal is to stop spread. The kind of testing we were doing just was never going to get there. And I do think bringing all of those pieces, and then ultimately where that combined with engineering, was this idea that, are we optimizing on the right components? I think that in some ways engineering principles bring some clarity to a pretty messy pandemic, and starting to reevaluate what we're optimizing on. Is it individual care, or is it stopping spread and at the population level? Those are really, really very different things that in the testing landscape were never well defined before this pandemic. And I would say it's still very muddied waters in terms of, is it public health testing? Is it medical testing? What the heck are we doing? And in some ways they couldn't be more different from each other.
We talk a lot about transdisciplinary teams, but you're like the transdisciplinary mind. You've got such an extraordinary broad thinking of these different disciplines. But recall when we started the pandemic in the US, we had no test, and we basically had promoted the spread. We couldn't even diagnose when people were coming in pneumonia that it actually was COVID pneumonia for weeks, if not almost a couple of months. And you were very early to think that not only should we get the PCR testing to a massive scale, but also, as you mentioned, we needed these other tests, whether you want to call them rapid tests, lateral flow tests, antigen tests. We needed them to get to the levels of testing that, as you say, would be suitable for individuals and population management of the pandemic. And as I recall, you were ready to go in like April or May 2020 with rapid tests. And what happened? What happened?
Well, I mean, yeah, there were companies. So just to be clear, I'm not a test manufacturer, but I've been living in the test technology world for quite a while and talking to a lot of both startups and larger companies about it. And there were companies out there able to produce millions of these rapid tests, by April, May. The first time I ever held one of these lateral flow rapid antigen tests in my hand for COVID was late March of 2020. And, I thought it was kind of a slam dunk, like, oh man, there are companies out there making tests that take 15 minutes to run. You could do them on your own. These are transmission indicating tests. They are, even if they're not as sensitive as a diagnostic, they'll catch everyone who's a super spreader. If that's all they did, that would have been amazing. That would have allowed us to keep society functioning. If everyone was able to perform a rapid test right before going into a location, into a restaurant, into a school, on a daily basis, and this kind of thing. And what happened is, as much as I hate to say it, this muddied picture, the medical establishment were some of the greatest barriers. And it's not a knock on physicians. I think the real issue is that we keep asking the wrong people the wrong questions. And we essentially asked physicians, or we asked, I shouldn't say individual physicians, we asked the ethers, if you will, how do we deal with a pandemic through a medical lens? And that was the wrong idea. We can't you can't claw back a pandemic by piling medicine up. And just in the way that we don't think that just treating everyone is the right solution to a pandemic, we also can't take medical metrics and apply that to pandemic response. We need to apply pandemic metrics. And if we deal with the pandemic, the medical problems resolve, but you will never deal with a pandemic by just treating medical problems and hope that the pandemic goes away. That's not how this works, unfortunately. And I think that what happened is we got very confused as a regulatory body, as a physician body, as a public health body about what are we doing with the test? Why are we asking people to test? Is it so that they can know that they were infected a few weeks ago? And if so, great, that's a physician's job. Why? My stomach hurt, I was vomiting last week, whatever the case may be. Do I think it was COVID? Let me use a PCR test. Heck, let me use an antibody test. But if the question is, am I safe to go out to go see my grandmother right now? Then a PCR test that you have to send out and get a result back 7 days later is not, it offers you no benefit. And we just don't have a language. We don't have a legal structure. We don't have a regulatory structure. We literally don't have a language. Christian Anderson at Scripps and I wrote an article in Science earlier this year. God, maybe that was earlier in 2020 now. That was titled COVID-19 Tests, One Size Does Not Fit All. And it was just trying to lay out a framework just to do the most simple thing, which is say, hey, not all tests are for medicine. There's actually a purpose of testing for public health. And it's just remarkable to think that we don't have, the FDA doesn't formally recognize a test for public health. From the FDA's perspective, there is no such thing as a test that an individual can use for public health purposes, where the purpose of that test is to benefit the people around them and not themselves. And one argument I've made, and I think is a correct argument, and that's that if the primary beneficiary of the test is not the test user, but the people around the test user, then that's a pretty simple definition for a test that's being used for public health. You're using a test for yourself. And in fact, the consequences of you getting a positive test not only are not medical, but they're antithetical to medicine. I know no physician who has ever prescribed 10 days of isolation to their sick patient for that patient's benefit. It's for the patient's family's benefit that you isolate. So it's not medicine, it's really public health. And I think, it's been very, very frustrating to be over 2 years into this pandemic and still to this day not have a regulatory framework that recognizes that there is a purpose of a test that is more about the public than about the user of that test. And the metrics required for that test is something very, very different than a medical diagnostic test.
Do you not see the recent adoption by the Biden administration of the test and sending it out to people as an acceptance of your premise? I know it's come very late in your mind, but
It's certainly, I would say, it is certainly a reflection that that something I've been arguing for a long time now for is now becoming and accepted as mainstream. When we have the President of the United States getting up and talking about the need for these tests to combat the pandemic, what is frustrating to still see, though, is that despite having the President of the United States on stage saying these are public health tools, that nobody is willing to go to the FDA and say, hey, are we evaluating these tests in the appropriate way? Did we go through the right, are we pushing these tests to be evaluated as public health tools versus as medical tools, or has the regulation continued to lag behind the actual use case of the tests? And I would argue that that has continued. And to this day, we still have, despite having a large number of rapid tests now, the way that we could have scaled them much faster during the Omicron surge, when the president first recognized that we were going to need a massive influx of tests, rather than saying our hands are tied, we can't scale up quick enough, we should have said, is there a better way to authorize these tests so that the billions of rapid tests that exist across the world, that we could have gotten a portion of those into the United States in a time frame that was actually commensurate with the need. And so while I think that the president, and I would say arguably the public at large, has recognized that this is a smart approach, it did come late. I'm perpetually frustrated that the regulation, that we still don't have a legal framework or language to talk about these as anything other than medicine.
Well, I just was going to say, though, Michael, that when I heard the announcement by President Biden, I thought he should have mentioned you during that announcement. If it hadn't been for the pioneering and perseverance of Dr. Professor Minnow, we might not have done this. So, you know, you should be proud, I really think. But the other thing about this is you've been kind about the FDA. You know, I think they really effed it up here big time, because as you say, they didn't accommodate this idea of infectious versus infected. They never got it. They still don't get it. But there's another part of the story that I find especially ironic, because that wasn't the only public health agency that basically was in a confusional state, couldn't deal with testing. The same day that the president announced that we're going to send out free tests, we had the director of the CDC say you don't need to do testing, just 5 days, and then you're good to go if you're not symptomatic or if you have mild symptoms. What did you think of that announcement?
I mean, I just, it was a disaster in my view. It is one of the least scientific announcements. You know, the CDC it is extremely frustrating to see that announcement come out. All of the data was showing that the relationship between Omicron and symptom onset and isolation windows was shifting markedly. And as a result of not having enough tests, you know, and having a massive pressure from the American public to say, why don't we have the tests? You know, the CDC took an approach that said, you know what, don't test, leave isolation early. You don't need the test. We don't have enough tests. And that is not the appropriate way to lead in a public health crisis. If we don't have the right resources, we have to make the policy. And if the policy can't live up to the science yet, because we don't have the resources, we have to say, look, this is the science. This is the biology. This is the reality. And part of that reality is, I'm sorry, but we don't have enough resources. But we encourage people to really focus on the fact that they still might be infectious at 5 days. And if you can do it, if you can get a test, do everything you can in your power to get one of those tests and use it before you go back to work at 5 days. Because, you know, what we have now shown, and we haven't seen a reversal from the CDC on this issue, we now know that individuals with Omicron who are at 5 days into their isolation window represent one of the highest risk groups out of any other definable group of people for risk of transmitting onwards. So if we're trying to use our resources wisely and use our tests in the most effective way, then one of the most, if not the most effective group of people to test to stop transmission would be the people who are about to leave isolation at 5 days. And there's simple things we could have done. We didn't need to have a test in every single person's home to suggest that everyone uses a test to exit isolation. Instead, we could have had the administration and the CDC allocate 30 million of their tests to Amazon warehouses around the country and say, look, these are test to exit isolation tests. And if you're positive, look, you have 5 full days to do one click, 1 day overnight delivery from Amazon to get your test so that you can exit safely at 5 days or not, or stay in if you're still infectious. We could be using these technological advancements and the might of the United States to do this kind of effort. And we just have really let the ball drop here.
I hear you about your frustration. I think we all shared that with not just governmental entities, but also, sort of the failure of the public to really have one view about this. In fact, to have a very, very polarized view. And I just want to ask you, as an engineer and someone with a multidisciplinary background, this is not new, by the way. I mean, from Camus' The Plague onwards, we've known and should have sort of expected this. But how do you write a manual going forward for the next pandemic that takes into account these things which are certainties, namely the clumsiness of big bodies and asking the wrong people the wrong question and public who's swayed by politics? I mean, how do you factor that in as a public health expert? Because it's part of the reality.
So I've thought a lot about this, and I think I honestly believe that one of the core problems in our entire pandemic response has been, social media is part of it, but really it's everyone asking the wrong people the wrong questions. Everyone had to get involved with pandemic response because it's such a big issue. And what that meant is, little by little, facts and understanding that existed before the pandemic gets chipped away. A lot of people entered the discussion who didn't know that X, Y, and Z was already known. And so they said, we have to reinvent the wheel and we have to go down this rabbit hole over here and think that we're discovering something for the first time. But it was really that the expert in that issue, their voice was just drowned out early. We had founder effects of people giving the wrong information, which proliferated. Obviously, I think some of the, I think our previous president was the greatest contributor to that. But I think that one of the most effective strategies that I can think of for future preparedness, without totally changing the world and causing Facebook and Twitter and everything to collapse, something that's actually reasonable and doable, is to create a something sort of like the National Guard. The National Guard are always on reserve, or the National Reserve rather, and they're signing up to say, look, if something happens in the next 5 years, you can count on me to step in and help. And so what I think we need is a National Guard of experts, and not just around infectious disease, but people who have expertise that is special to some sort of disaster response, whatever that might be. We should have a database. The government should have a database. And if you want to sign up, that I could say, look, this is my area of expertise. If you're going to ask me a question, it should be in this issue or this series of issues, but don't ask me about jellyfish. I know nothing about jellyfish. If there's an epidemic of jellyfish in the Great Lakes or something, I don't want to talk about it because I'm the wrong person to ask. It might be some epidemic, but it's not what I study. So have people very clearly define what their area of expertise is. And then we should have a playbook. There's only so many different catastrophes that are going to happen. It's going to be another influenza virus, another coronavirus. It's going to be a bioterrorism threat with anthrax. What is it going to be? An earthquake? And we can have playbooks for all of these. There's no reason that the President of the United States should dictate the way that we respond to a biological threat. Biological threats don't respond well to politics. They'll keep doing their thing no matter who's president. And so I think that we need a playbook that keeps the experts in this country, the expertise in this country, that keeps them cataloged. And heck, people like the three of us on this call can sign up and say, over the next 5 years, if you need my expertise, I am at your service. And this is what that service is, so that when the next disaster happens, I want the president of the United States to have a button to push. And he says respiratory virus pandemic. And it gives him an all-star team of people with defined expertise so that people aren't going out and trying to scramble amidst an emergency to ask who knows what they're talking about what. We're so far beyond that. We shouldn't have that. We have enough problems when we're dealing with a virus. The last thing we should be dealing with is misinformation that isn't even intentional. And I think that if we could do that and have enough of a varied idea, we don't want to have real echo chambers there, but have a good enough database. And that would at least be the place to start, to have the playbook and know who you're going to call upon in different scenarios. We don't go to war and after we're at war say, oh, who's going to be our general for this one? We don't do that. We know who has expertise in this or that missile defense system, and we call upon those people when needed.
So speaking of expertise, you recently made a career change to take your cumulative extraordinary experience and background to work in the life science industry. Tell us what was going through your mind and what you're doing these days.
Well, I started to feel increasingly like my hands were tied in academia. I have always liked to build things. When I was in college or right after college, I did a lot of work in Nicaragua, and I started I guess it was in medical school actually. God, the years stages of life get weird. It was in medical school. I started a nonprofit in rural Nicaragua to teach communities how to build generators using solar power to convert table salt into chlorine for purifying their water. And that was an example of me, like, I just wasn't feeling satisfied with I felt like I needed to build something and really put my education into practice. And this pandemic has really reinforced in me that both a desire to build lasting things that can actually help people, but also taught me that that words in academic papers only go so far. We all write, we want to get nature papers and science papers, and then we cross our fingers and hope that some company will pick it up and actually do something good with the world, for the world with that research. And I found that one of the most impactful ways that I could probably use my expertise is to go out and build something. And in academia, it's really hard to do it in that construct because you always have postdocs. They're coming and going. You can't build good cohesive teams easily in academia because everyone wants to be a first author or a last author, and there's no good mechanism for real true teamwork where every person on that team has a pivotal role, that they're playing their role and they are getting the credit that they feel they deserve. And so in academia, it's hard to have, you might have big teams, but they generally have one leader and first and last author, and everyone else has their main interest somewhere else. And the turnover rate is very high because everyone's going on to their next profession. And so as much as I love teaching, I really love teaching, I really want to create teams that function as a true unified team towards goals and can move the field forward. And so that's what I'm doing here at eMed. It's to try to plow a whole new world. And that world that I see is that we can start to break down the barriers that people have in their medical care. If I learned one thing about this from this pandemic, it's that the system, if you will, and I don't like to just kind of say those words because they don't really mean much, but let's just say the system does not really have a good way to enable individuals to know about their own medical condition on their own terms. And I really want people to have the liberty to say, look, I'm curious if I have COVID today, or I'm curious if I have flu today. And if so, I want to get it treated as fast as possible without having to go and worry about my insurance and worrying about going to a physician for these things that aren't complex problems. And what I really want to do is to create a system here at eMed that enables somebody to have diagnostics or other devices in their home or other access that enable them to very quickly, on their own terms, when they want, be able to find out information about themselves and act on that information. If I have COVID, I want to be able to do it when I'm done, before I go to work in the morning or after I get back from work, I start to feel not well. I don't want to have to take tomorrow off from work to figure out I have adenovirus. I want to take tonight and use a COVID test at home. If I'm negative, then I go to work tomorrow. If I'm positive, I want to get treatment as soon as possible without having to figure out who's going to pay for my insurance. And that's what I'm trying to do at eMed, is starting with COVID, is create a test to treat model where people on their own terms can have a test like the one I'm holding here. I'm not a test manufacturer, but I happen to be holding an Abbott test. And you can see this little QR code here. This QR code might not look like much, but it actually gives somebody the ability, you scan that QR code and it initiates a whole cascade that allows somebody within an hour to go from using a test at home to getting a treatment prescribed to them at their local pharmacy without ever leaving their couch. And imagine if parents could do that every time their kid gets a sore throat, if they could use a strep test at home and be able to get their kid treated if that strep test is positive without having to take half a day to go to the pediatrician, and be able to start their kid on treatment earlier. You'd run into many fewer severe cases in the hospital. You'd get people treated earlier, and ultimately you improve health and the economy. And so that's kind of where I'm going right now as I start to exit my academic hat for the time being and try to put some of these pieces in process. And I guess you could see from my varied history and the paths I've taken, I certainly won't write off going back to academia, but for now I felt such a burning need to do something more concrete in this pandemic, and I'm really delighted and happy to have made the shift for now.
I think that's very exciting, actually. One of the things that we observed with telemedicine is that we were humbled to realize that it was the first time we were actually looking into people's homes. And for all our, lip service to social history, family history, it's only when you see people crisscrossing the room or realize that they're in this one room and there is nowhere else to go and they're using their phone or they're parked outside a motel that you really begin to sort of understand how people live. And by that same token, I remember thinking in those interactions that it would be great if we could have more diagnostic equipment in the house, sort of situated there, so these exchanges could be more meaningful. So I think your kind of testing is going to pave the way for that sort of thing.
And we see it entering all over the place, including at Scripps with digital clinical trials. That Scripps is really leading the way in that kind of effort of how do we distribute clinical trials and bring them closer to people in their homes, so that the middle of the country that's not near some Ivy League or similar academic institution can actually participate in the newest cancer cancer treatment trials and things like that. And I think home diagnostics, to me, a diagnostic isn't some medical device. To me, a diagnostic it's information. It's information about ourselves. It's information that helps us with our own health, but also with public health in the middle of a pandemic. And nobody should be deprived of information. We have to make sure we do it appropriately, that people know how to deal with the information, for sure. But the more access, I think, that people can have to information, the better. I think that if there's any human right out there, it's knowing about what's going on inside your own body.
Couldn't agree more. If you could put on your evolutionary biologist hat for a moment, where are we going? Is there going to be another significant variant in the months ahead, or is it possible that we're waning our way out of the pandemic?
Well, I think we are on the only off-ramp of this pandemic that ever existed. There was no other option, which is good because we are getting there. We're actually on the off-ramp in terms of we've built up significant population level heterologous immunity through a combination of vaccines and infections. I like to think of humans in this pandemic like I normally think of babies. A lot of my research before the pandemic was looking at how the immune system of babies develop, and we developed a lot of immunological tools to profile babies' immune systems. And through that process, we were able to see that kids, they develop their immune system layer by layer by layer. Every time they get an infection, they throw 90% of the immunological education they had away, and they retain about 10% of it. And then they get a re-exposure and they retain a little bit more and a little bit more. And as you grow up, I like to think of as our immune system developing in the same way that like we use our clothes. As if you're really little, then you go through your clothes real fast. You're always throwing them away and getting new clothes. And as you grow up, everything kind of stabilizes. And we as adults are in this process of growing up our immune system to this virus. We're aging out of this pandemic. The virus isn't going away. And so we're building these layers and layers of immunity, which we absolutely had to do this. And it's been absolutely painful. But I think where we are right now, I think we'd be very naive to think that there's not likely another variant. History, even the short history that we've had this pandemic tells us otherwise. But the important thing is the impact of that variant. The importance of it is going to be increasingly reduced as we move forward. And so I think we'll definitely have cases again spike up in the summer in July and August. We'll definitely have cases again surge in the winter. This is a seasonal virus. People question whether it's a seasonal virus, but that's because there's this confusion. People keep confusing the force of infection and the fact that the virus can transmit in the summer with the fact that, yes, it can, but it can transmit a lot more in the winter. And so I think we should definitely anticipate that we'll have more cases, but the really good thing is we now have vaccines and we have treatments. Vaccines alone take care of the vast majority, vaccines and previous exposures. And we can't discount those previous infections. It sets us up knowing that what has happened in the past, we can't undo it. We are in a really good position now, relatively speaking, to keep marching forward. We have treatments now, and if we can tie those treatments to actual access to getting care and to getting those treatments on time, then all of a sudden the importance that this virus has on society really starts to erode. It starts to play less and less and less a role as we start to see people get treated earlier or just not get sick as much. And I think that that's where we're at. And so that's why I am glad that the CDC is changing some of its thinking from just counting cases to really looking at hospitalizations. I do think that we need other metrics. We don't want to be 3 weeks behind the curve all the time, only looking at hospitalizations. But I think as we see cases grow again in the summer and the winter, we will see a very dampened hospitalization curve associated with that, as long as we actually do what we need to now, which is make sure the processes are in place for people to get treated if they're at risk. The elderly are going to continue, probably indefinitely, to have problems because their immune systems will not develop the way that a baby's would or a 25-year-old person's immune system would. The older you get, you start to lose the architecture of that immune memory compartment. And so it's harder to store those memories, just like it's harder to learn a new language when you get older. And so we have to be cognizant that the elderly, no matter how many times we boost them, they're still going to wane. So we have to keep making sure that treatments are available. But otherwise, I think we're really on the off ramp here.
Well, I think that's a wonderful metaphor of adding layers and layers of immunity. I have to ask you, because this was such important work before COVID, and that is your work on measles. And I'm not sure I fully understood it, but I knew it was seminal work. Do you sort of explain that to us? How measles seems to make you lose your immunity in some paradoxical way?
Yeah, so what we call that is immunological amnesia. And the way that we discovered it in large part was I was working at the time with Brian Grenfell, who has developed a lot of the mathematical models to understand and interpret epidemics and outbreaks, primarily developing those methods using measles as a model infection, which many mathematical modelers love measles because it's so regular in the pre-vaccine era. And what we saw was that when we look at the data appropriately, we saw that there's actually this long shadow of death that follows measles cases. And if you sort of integrate under the curve, if you will, and of measles outbreaks, and you do some mathematical transformations, you find an extraordinary correlation between the amount of measles cases on the one hand and the amount of death that follows over the next 2 to 3 years in children. And so we hypothesized at the time, and this was 2015, we put that paper out in Science that showed that measles seemed to have, at a population level, a very strong impact where it appeared at a population level to cause children to be at increased risk of death for years following an outbreak. And so, of course, the next question is, well, how does that work? Well, it turns out that measles actually binds, it's the receptor for measles is called CD150. And or SLAM, signaling of lymphocyte activation molecule. And it's decorating lymphocytes and memory committed cells, including plasma cells in our bone marrow, including the cells that make up our germinal centers. SLAM is all over the place for our memory committed cells. And that happens to be the measles receptor. That was discovered earlier in 2000s and published in Nature that this was the receptor. Previous to that, it was thought to be an innate receptor called CD46. Now it turned out to be the vaccine receptor. But in any case, to make a long story short, it turns out that measles works as a Trojan horse. The very cells that are supposed to pick it up, chew it up, and present it end up getting infected by it. It then gets into the lymph. It gets picked up by these dendritic cells, brought into the lymph, where it just goes to town, chewing up and destroying all of these cells that it turns on and uses them for its own replication. In macaques, you can use GFP expressing measles virus, and on necropsy, shine just a fluorescent lamp, and you can literally, without a microscope, you can see with the naked eye all of the germinal centers that are comprising the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, because measles just completely obliterates and goes anywhere where these lymphocytes are. And so that led us to say, well, if that's a mechanism, but that's putatively what we saw in 2015 at the population level. So in 2019, I was working with Steve Elledge as a postdoc at Harvard in genetics, and we used phage display systems to present peptides of every virus known to infect humans. And that gives us a window into somebody's immunological memory through their antibody response against hundreds of thousands of different viral peptides. And we found kids, working with some folks in the Netherlands, Rick de Swart being primary, he had collected blood from kids before and after they got measles in the Netherlands to do some cellular work on it. And so we took some of that blood before and a couple months after kids got measles. And what we saw is the antibody repertoire, not just one titer, but the whole repertoire was diminished anywhere from 20 to 80% after kids got measles. Now, to be clear, it is very difficult to screw up somebody's antibody repertoire. Even rituximab and things like that don't really screw up your antibody repertoire. And so it turned out that measles is really getting into the plasma cells of the bone marrow and just obliterating a lot of these, the workhorse cells that produce the long-lived memory antibodies that we have. And it's hard for kids to, you can't just recompose those. Once they're dead, a plasma cell's gone. And so we found, which was, I think, one of the most intriguing or interesting and sort of satisfying findings, was that we actually saw by the reconstruction of kids' immune responses, we were actually able to see, okay, all these kids lost a huge plethora of antibodies. And then we saw, well, but some kids went up for certain antibodies. You know, some kids went up for rhinovirus or for adenovirus or for pneumococcal bacteria, pneumococcus. And what it turned out, when we actually plotted them out geographically, like where their houses are, we saw that the kids who had adenovirus increases, they all lived right near each other. So we were actually identifying kids as they reconstructed their immune response after getting measles. They would see a little adenovirus outbreak happen over here, a rhinovirus outbreak happen over here. But importantly, it wasn't just benign. Reconstructing your immune memory is a dangerous feat. It's necessary but dangerous because immune memory is there to keep you safe. And so we saw was a lot of kids who had lost a lot of their pneumococcal antibodies were actually getting sick with pneumococcal pneumonia or otitis media, for example. And so it's not without its risks. And I think that we got a little window into these big population level effects that we had seen 4 or 5 years earlier from the decades of data we had evaluated across multiple countries to give us the first inkling that there was this shadow of death that followed measles outbreaks.
That's fascinating on immune amnesia from measles. And we're not going to be amnestic to this discussion with you, Michael. This has been fabulous. I actually wish we could go on for a few more hours because I know we'd learn a lot. I know all the folks listening would learn a lot too. But thanks so much for not just this conversation, but all you've done through the pandemic to get it straight. It's been frustrating, I know, for you especially, because you knew where we needed to go. We're still not there, but we made some progress thanks to your Herculean, really, efforts. And we're wishing you well in this new phase and know you're going to be making lots of great contributions going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much,
you very
Michael.
much.
Thanks to both of you, actually. Both of your Twitter feeds are really linchpins for people getting good information on COVID. So thank you both so much.